In this hour, I want to present a history of biological anthropology, which coalesced in the late 20th century to incorporate a three-pronged approach to understanding who we are and where we come from. This will be anthropology because it will focus on human relations, human variation, and human origins. And it will be biological because we will be working with monkeys and DNA and anatomy. But before we became biological, we were physical anthropology, concerned with the physical aspects of human variation as opposed to the mental ones. There will be a lot of intellectual threads to pull on here. We often encounter potted histories in which the discovery of the transformation of species was central to physical anthropology. Well, it was central to one thread, obviously the one that asks, where did we come from? But physical anthropology begins more broadly, with just the question of why are people different from one another, and yet similar to monkeys? Let's look at the major discoveries and inflection points that got us where we are intellectually in biological anthropology, and to begin with our relationship to the non-human primates. Familiarity with them and their special relationship to humans is certainly older than recorded history. In Borneo, they called the orangutan the man of the woods. Moreover, the practice of focusing on some particular similarity between humans and monkeys as being especially meaningful is very old. In ancient Egypt, there was a cult devoted to the baboon god Thoth. The Egyptians were particularly into their male hamadryas baboons. They seem to have kept vervet monkeys as pets, but venerated hamadryas baboons. In particular, they venerated male hamadryas baboons. And they seem to have had a particular fixation with its penis, which lacks a foreskin. It's even believed that the priests of Thoth began the practice of circumcision in the Near East in an attempt to emulate their baboon god. They didn't think they were descended from baboons, but they certainly thought there was a special relationship there. The ancient Greeks were familiar with the Barbary macaque and distinguished this tailless monkey from the other ones with which they were also familiar. Aristotle refers to most monkeys as kebos, but to the Barbary macaque as pithekos. These were both distinguished from the dog-headed baboon, or kynocephalus. The Romans, on the other hand, transliterated the Greek into the Latin cynocephalus, but collapsed the other non-human primates into a single word, simia. Eventually, English would follow the Greek in distinguishing tailed primates from non-tailed primates lexically, and French would follow Latin with just a single word for tailed and tailless primates, in this case, singe. That becomes important when you confront the primate literature in other languages and earlier times. Nevertheless, the special relationship among all animals that the non-human primates had, on account of their similarities to us, was very clear. An ancient Roman poet named Quintus Ennius wrote, "How similar to us is the monkey, the most horrid beast." His works have been lost, but they were quoted by Cicero and thereby memorized by centuries of Latin students. That quotation was literally reprinted in two of the most influential works of early science, by the philosopher Francis Bacon and biologist Carl Linnaeus. So this is no secret. The first official encounter of science with the hominoidea involves a young male chimpanzee who made it back to England alive briefly and was dissected by the anatomist Edward Tyson in 1699. Tyson refers to the creature as an orangutan and as a pygmy, and contrasts it with a monkey, an ape, and a man. It's clearly a chimpanzee. Tyson is struck not only by its overall similarity to people, but also by the unusual way in which it moved around. He knew both that it was ill, and that it was built along the same plan as the human body, which is erect and bipedal. But he didn't actually see it walk that way. He saw it walk on its knuckles. So he decides that it was basically made to walk upright like us, but he has it drawn standing upright with the aid of a cane. That cane will stay with pictures of apes for the next 150 years. And Tyson explains, "Our merchants tell me when first they take apes or monkeys to learn them to go erect, they usually tie their hands behind them. And I am of the philosopher's mind that naturally they go more on all four than erect. But whether 'tis so in our pygmy, I do doubt, since walking on its knuckles, as our pygmy did, seems no natural posture, and 'tis sufficiently provided in all respects to walk erect." Eventually, English will settle on the word ape for these tailless non-human primates, and include gibbons, orangutans, and eventually the gorilla. Anatomical similarities between humans and what the English were calling apes naturally led to some speculation about their relationship to humans. Edward Tyson had understood his pygmy in the context of Cartesian dualism, in which the chimpanzee was a physical link between humans and animals, but lacked the spiritual link to the angels provided by speech. In 1809, the biologist Lamarck imagined the possibility of a historical linkage between four-handed and two-handed creatures. If some race of four-handed animals, especially one of the most perfect of them, were to lose by force of circumstance or some other causes the habit of climbing trees and grasping the branches with its feet in the same way as with its hands in order to hold on to it, and if the individuals of this race were forced for a series of generations to use their feet only for walking and to give up using their hands-like feet, there is no doubt that these four-handed animals would at length be transformed into two-handed, and that the thumbs on their feet would cease to be separated from the other digits when they only use their feet for walking. And that is before science even encounters the gorilla. The first gorilla in the London Zoo is on exhibit in 1859, 7 months before the publication of The Origin of Species. And you can even hear a lecture by Richard Owen, who a few months later will be a staunch anti-Darwinian, observe several points in the habits of this animal as well as its osteology to show its nearer approach to man than any other animals of the tribe. But what does he even mean by man? An English Christian gentleman? Or something a bit broader? That brings us to the second question, after the relationships of people to non-human primates, namely, what kinds of people are there? Well, there's all kinds of people, all over the place. The ancient Egyptians recognized that some of the peoples they encountered to the north were paler and some to the south were darker. They weren't blind, but they also color-coded their images in symbolic and non-melanic ways. For example, they painted women and men different colors. The point is that the ancient world recognized that different people in different places looked, dressed, spoke, and acted differently, but they conceptualized that diversity in local terms. The Greeks could contrast themselves against the Ethiopians to the south, Ethiops meaning burnt face in Greek, but the contrast was symbolic, not hierarchical or continental. This is a drinking vessel called a cantharos, and they commonly would have two different faces on either side, like the god Janus. So this is a Janiform cantharos. These examples happen to be a Greek face and an Ethiopian face, but there were supposedly all kinds of exotic peoples in addition to the Ethiopians. A big bestseller of the 14th century called The Travels of Sir John Mandeville literally plagiarized Pliny the Elder from 1300 years earlier, talking about the Blemii being without heads in Africa, the Monocoly having only one leg and shading themselves with their foot, and the Arimaspi being noted for having one eye in the middle of their forehead. They were all, of course, different kinds of people, if weird. There was a counter-narrative, however. The Bible says that after the big flood, Noah and his sons got off the big boat in the mountains of Ararat and became fruitful and multiplied. Each of the 3 sons became founders of their own cities and local people. Although they're not geographically discrete in the Bible, by the Middle Ages the legend had crystallized into Ham being the father of Africans, Shem being the father of Asians, and Japheth being the father of Europeans. And this knowledge is encoded in a type of a map called a TO map. Hopefully you can see the T and the O. North is to the left, however, so it will look a little more familiar if we rotate the map 90 degrees. Europe north, Africa south, Asia east, each founded by a son of Noah, and all looking rather alike because, after all, they're brothers. Now, of course, this map is for understanding the world, not for navigating it. This map is not going to get you from point A to point B, but is a metaphorical origin narrative for the peoples and continents of the world, and as such it works just fine. Unless, of course, they find another continent. Which is, of course, exactly what happened. Here's a late version of the same kind of map. You've got Europe, Asia, and Africa, and Jerusalem in the center because it's the most important place in the world. But notice what's missing, in addition to the T and the O. Noah's sons and the Ark. Why? Because of what's there in the lower left. America, the New World. Now you've got 4 continents but only 3 sons. Either we have to give Noah another son, or we have to come up with a new metaphor for understanding the continents of the world, which used to be 3 and now are suddenly 4. And so, over the course of the 1500s, European artists and map makers come up with a new metaphor for the continents of the world. No longer will they be the descendants of Noah. They will now be 4 scantily clad ladies. By the early 1600s, this metaphor is so firmly entrenched in the European imagination that this book, Iconology by Cesare Ripa, explains how to draw things allegorically, and in this particular case, how actually to represent the continents. America has a feather headdress, a bow and arrow, and is astride an alligator. Africa wears an elephant head for a hat and hangs out with scorpions and lions. And you may notice that these are not racialized images. They are symbolizing the land masses, not the people on the land masses. Asia has a laurel wreath, a camel, and incense. And Europe has a crown, a church, and a horse. This will be the 4 continents in art for the next couple of centuries. More frequently, you will see Europe with a bull, which is the form in which Zeus came to Europa when he raped her. But this is well entrenched in the artistic community by the mid-1600s, the idea that we can symbolize the 4 continents of the world as 4 women. Not only that, but maybe the 4 women can start pulling double symbolic duty by representing not just the land masses, but the people on the land masses as well. And that is, of course, exactly what happens. Linnaeus will invent modern taxonomy in the middle of the 1700s, and when it comes to describing the human species, he will take what is already known symbolically from the art world and transfer that into the scientific world. From the mid-1600s, Here are the 4 continents allegorically. From left to right, Asia, Europe, America, and Africa. 3 of them are at the feet of Miss Europe, and Miss Africa is now racialized, standing not just for the continent of Africa, but for the dark-skinned peoples who live there. The European encounter with Australia will ultimately make the 4 continental women obsolete, and this 18th century map is still using the symbolic imagery directly from Cesare Ripa's iconology. And Miss Africa is racialized, standing not just for the continent of Africa, but for the dark-skinned peoples who live there. This is from 1721, and Linnaeus has not yet set pen to paper on his taxonomic work, The System of Nature. Linnaeus will invent modern taxonomy in the middle of the 1700s, and when it comes to describing the human species, he will take what is already known symbolically from the art world, 4 different people representing the 4 continents, and transfer that into the scientific world. Essentially, modern biology dates itself from the 10th edition of System of Nature by the Swedish biologist Carl Linnaeus in 1758, who organized the natural world into nested categories of equal rank: species within genera, genera within orders, orders within classes, etc. Within the order primates, he identified a genus Homo. Within the genus Homo, he identified a species Homo sapiens. What was there within the species Homo sapiens? And with a little bit of fudging, the answer was what the artists had been saying for over a century. Namely, there are 4 different kinds of people on 4 different continents. Except that the artists were talking metaphorically, and Linnaeus is talking scientifically. He will color code 4 varieties of humans. He doesn't actually call them subspecies because that term won't be coined until a bit later. And he gives you their distinct personality types, as well as their systems of government and clothing preferences. Nevertheless, Linnaeus's influence on biological science was so vast that after Linnaeus, if you want to study the human species scientifically, you start by telling us how many kinds of people there are and how to tell them apart. And that will be true for the next 200 years in the scientific community. The next question follows from that one. Once you've decided how many kinds of people there are, then where'd they come from? Well, the Bible's pretty clear. They're all descended somehow from Noah, and certainly before that, all descended from Adam and Eve, which would, on the surface of it, suggest that we are all brothers and sisters under the skin. But an alternative suggestion was put forward in 1655 by a pious scholar named Isaac de la Pereire. Based on his interpretation of some verses in St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, he suggests that maybe we are misunderstanding the beginning of Genesis. Clearly there's a lot the Bible has left out, like gunpowder and heliocentrism. So maybe the Bible also left out the various creations of people before Adam in different places. In other words, maybe Adam and Eve were just the progenitors of the peoples of the Middle East, and other places were populated by the descendants of other divine creations. While the book was initially burnt publicly and subject to about 50 refutations, its thesis gained traction over the course of the 1700s as a theological rationalization for slavery. After all, if Europeans and Africans were the products of different creative acts by God, then Europeans enslaving Africans might be different only in magnitude from Europeans domesticating horses. Not surprisingly, this idea, known as polygenism, for multiple origins, reached its greatest popularity just before the Civil War. But it's worth noting that the intellectual issues don't line up in a familiar way. The monogenists had the moral high ground as a theological justification for abolitionism. They were biblical literalists. The polygenists, less piously, argued that the Bible required interpretation, and that the earth had to be older than the Bible suggested since it had left so much stuff out. This position seemed actually to be supported by the geologists discovering that the world actually was very old. And this was literally the beginnings of physical anthropology in America, being on the wrong side of this issue. Moreover, if you believed that we were all descended from Adam and Eve, you had to decide what they looked like and how so many different kinds of people could have descended from them. In other words, you had to develop theories of microevolution to account for human diversity. And so the monogenists, the biblical literalists, are also the earliest evolutionists. Microevolutionists, to be sure, but they're thinking about evolutionary processes decades before Darwin, and specifically in relation to the question of the origin of racial diversity. The work that resolves this argument, even though it didn't talk about racial diversity, was indeed The Origin of Species in 1859. Remember that in the US in 1859, nobody gave a shit about giraffe necks or finch beaks. The Civil War was about to start. People cared about slavery. And Darwin's American friend Asa Gray presents this as the major lesson from The Origin of Species. The very first step backwards, phylogenetically, makes the Negro and the Hottentot our blood relations. Not that reason or scripture objects to that, though pride may. The next suggests the closer association of our ancestors of the olden time with our poor relations of the four-handed family than we'd like to acknowledge. In other words, we're all brothers and sisters under the skin. But our common ancestor wasn't Adam, it was a sort of ape. It's also important to remember that everybody is trying to appear pious here, but their piety is often kind of weird. So, for example, in 1860, nobody in the intellectual community is rejecting the idea of an old Earth, or that different species lived at different times. The creationists within the intellectual community who rejected Darwin were just trying to preserve one last bit of quasi-biblical piety, namely the miraculous origin of species rather than the naturalistic origin of species. There was a lot going on in the intellectual life of Euro-Americans in the early 1860s, in addition to the Civil War. In 1863, there were some pious scholars who resolutely clung to the Garden of Eden, trying to rescue the biblical narrative by arguing that all of these extinct animals, from dinosaurs to saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths, all existed in a long, unfolding, ancient pre-modern world before the Garden of Eden. The biblical story would still work here, as just the frosting on the geological layer cake. Charles Lyell, however, explained that it could no longer be denied that humans lived a really long time ago, and in fact coexisted with extinct mammals. Thomas Huxley's book the same year explained that it could no longer be denied that humans were really like apes physically, and thus ought to be classified with them zoologically. And Ernest Renan's Life of Jesus explained that it could no longer be denied that the miracles of Jesus were, just like all other miracles, simple misunderstandings of natural events, and Jesus himself was not so much a Mediterranean demigod, but rather a sort of Nordic wise man. That's a lot to mull over, along with slavery. Moreover, Thomas Huxley had included an illustration of a fossil skull that had been found in Germany a few years earlier. And it was a bit different from a familiar human head, with thick brow ridges, no forehead, and a pointy back. Weird person like the Blemmyi, or non-person like the chimpanzee? It will take scholars specializing in the anatomy of the skull to tell. But those people, unfortunately, had mostly been on the wrong side of the Civil War. Europeans will be debating the meaning of the fossil heads and bones and comparing them to modern humans. After the Civil War, physical anthropology in America goes quiet for a while, and European science takes the lead in the study of human diversity, or as it was known, race. Here, cranial anatomy took the forefront in documenting and explaining human variation. As explained by Giuseppe Sergi in 1893, the skull chiefly furnishes the characters of classification. It shows the external shape of the brain, the most important and highest organ of man. The skull is the means of the classification of the brain. He assumes you know why we need to classify brains. Incidentally, Giuseppe Sergi's most prominent student was named Maria Montessori, and she went into education. Now, Sergi explained why the study of skulls is important, and of course skulls become an obsession with physical anthropology for that very reason. So we should pause and take a look at the syllogism that was at the heart of both 19th century physical anthropology and 19th century phrenology. Phrenology was derived from the science of anatomy and rooted in strongly scientific materialist premises. In other words, this was not pseudoscience. This was science by the scientists. It was just stupid, bogus science. As Sergi told us, the skull encases the brain, and of course we all know what brains do. Brains think. A good brain thinks good thoughts, and a bad brain thinks bad thoughts. Phrenologists began with an idealized image of the human head, to which they assigned regions and associated them with cranial functions. If you were a creative person, that is because the part of your brain that secretes creativity is hypertrophied and is creating excess creativity for you. And this was coming from the science of anatomy. This was fully materialistic scientific reasoning. And in the mid-1800s, educated people did it, kind of like 23andMe. It was fun. It was kind of science, and you didn't have to believe the results if you didn't want to. Not only that, but it worked on dead people. You didn't even have to be alive to be examined phrenologically. But who had the skulls? We had the skulls. And it was the early physical anthropologists who showed that diversity in human skull form made phrenology nonsensical. People had normal thoughts with all kinds of weird heads, which of course were related to child rearing practices. So in the later 19th century, physical anthropologists eventually had some productive value in making sense of human heads. Of course, skulls do tell you something, but not what the phrenologists were interested in. Unlike the phrenologists who simply felt skulls, the physical anthropologists measured them and used statistics to compare them, not just as individuals but as groups. But first they had to establish standard orientations and standard measurements so that different skulls could be readily compared. And the Europeans got together and did this in the 1880s in Frankfurt. Consequently, the Frankfurt plane is still used as the basic way to orient a skull in profile. And the fellow who organized that Frankfurt conference was Rudolf Virchow, who was the leading human biologist in Europe. And he co-founds the Berlin Society for Anthropology, Ethnology, and Prehistory, where anthropology means literally physical anthropology. And you've got 3 of the 4 fields of anthropology together in that name. They have a protege named Franz Boas who will add the fourth field, linguistic anthropology, to American anthropology. Physical anthropology is going to be reinvented in the United States at the end of the 19th century, with the hiring of, in order, Franz Boas at the American Museum in New York and Columbia University, Aleš Hrdlička at the Smithsonian, and Ernest Houghton at Harvard. Franz Boas got his PhD in physics and then moved into human geography and trained in physical anthropology in Germany. Aleš Hrdlička was a medical doctor who trained in physical anthropology in France, and Ernest Houghton got his PhD in classics at the University of Wisconsin and then trained in physical anthropology in England. They had very little background in common. In fact, they only had 206 things in common, namely the bones in the skeleton of a Native American body. These guys became the experts in Native American bones. Boas studied human variation from the standpoint of the effects of cultural adaptation upon biology, and ultimately will move out of human biology entirely and into culture. Especially when it comes to race, Boas comes to appreciate that there is a lot more culture in race than most of his contemporaries want to admit. Hrdlička was a museum scientist and not involved in training students, but he was the organizer who got it together to start editing the American Journal of Physical Anthropology in 1918 and organizing the American Association of Physical Anthropologists some years later. Houghton trained an entire generation of physical anthropologists at Harvard, and most of his students ended up in the National Academy of Sciences, but also repudiating the old idea that Houghton himself cherished most, namely that there was some kind of basic causal connection, however crude or subtle, between what you look like and what you think like. The big intellectual break, both in physical anthropology and in human genetics, was World War II, and the recognition that there was a lot of continuity between bad German racial science and good American racial science. The kindly old scholar on the left is Eugen Fischer, who was the leading human geneticist and physical anthropologist in Germany. When he turned 60 in 1934, his loving students published a volume in his honor that included contributions from 2 future presidents of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists. Why would the great anatomist Franz Weidenreich accuse him of being a war criminal in the leading science journal in America immediately after the war? Oh, right, that's why. Some people went along reluctantly. Eugen Fischer wasn't one of them. After the war, the people who rebuild physical anthropology differently for the next generation will be Sherwood Washburn, who does his PhD under Ernest Houghton on primate anatomy, although Hrdlička won't let him publish his work on the ontogeny of the skull in rats in the AJPA, because rats don't belong in the AJPA. Washburn had been working at Columbia and moved his anatomy research to the University of Chicago with a half-time appointment in anthropology in 1947. Somewhere along the line, the anatomy department reneged on his appointment, and anthropology at Chicago picked him up full-time. That motivated Washburn to give up rat heads and start working on baboon behavior. Eventually, he will give primatology an academic home within physical anthropology, rather than have it scattered around psychology, anatomy, biology, and veterinary school departments. Theodosius Dobzhansky trained initially in Leningrad, which was an international center for ecological genetics in the early 20th century. Then visited Thomas Hunt Morgan's fruit fly lab at Columbia University in the mid-1920s, and never returned to Russia until very late in life. His 1937 book, Genetics and the Origin of Species, was influential in bringing theoretical population genetics into its first degree of alignment with the study of natural populations. He was a major architect of the synthetic theory of evolution, and although his primary research was fruit flies, by the 1940s he was seen as an authority on human diversity as well. He was instrumental in shifting the conversation in physical anthropology from abstract races to real populations. Of course, paleoanthropology had been part of physical anthropology as an arcane anatomical specialization. But in 1959, Louis Leakey makes it a sort of glory field and makes East Africa its center for the next few decades. This will form the three-headed monster of physical anthropology for the next generation: primates, human variation, and paleoanthropology. Obviously, there were a lot of other scholars involved, but these are the three figureheads. They will also be the representatives of the last generation entirely dominated by white males. Women will start making intellectual inroads in primatology in the 1960s. But the issue of academic sexism brings us to biopolitics, and the more recent development of an appreciation for the biopolitics of physical anthropology. Certainly World War II showed that this was a science that could readily be weaponized. And that is something that the generation who got their PhDs during and immediately after the war had to grapple with. Ernest Houghton had feared that bad German racial anthropology was making good American racial anthropology look bad. This is a famous photo by the New York photographer Ouija of a showgirl reading one of Houghton's popular books called Apes, Men, and Morons. And Houghton warns in this 1937 book, "There is, however, a rapidly growing aspect of physical anthropology which is nothing less than a malignancy. Unless it is excised, it will destroy the science. I refer to the perversion of racial studies and of the investigation of human heredity to political uses and to class advantage. Under such circumstances, the output of physical anthropology may become so suspect that it is impossible to accept the results of research without looking behind them for a political motive." Houghton was right. You can't study race apolitically. It is a fundamentally politically loaded idea. Physical anthropology was founded on the proposition of identifying the inherent biological cause of European military economic dominance. Today we realize that the best you can do is to make your cultural prejudices as transparent and as benign as possible, for there is no uncultural human science. During World War II, in fact, the USO had commissioned a booklet by the prominent cultural anthropologist Ruth Benedict to explain to our boys in uniform just what the Axis powers were wrong about when it came to race. What were our boys actually fighting for? Ruth Benedict took on a junior co-author named Gene Weltfish, and they produced The Races of Mankind in 1943, which was widely distributed to servicemen, until some Southern congressmen realized that they were teaching un-American ideas about racial equality. He had the booklet withdrawn, banned, and eventually declared subversive. Here is the terrifying final scene from the animated version of the booklet.
We have to see to it that there's equal opportunity for everyone from the very beginning. An equal start in life. Equal chance for health and medical care. And a good education. An equal chance for a job. Then we can all go forward together.
And in the Red Scare of the early 1950s, Columbia University fired Weltfish on the front page of the New York Times. Ruth Benedict was already dead. Ashley Montagu was fired by Rutgers around the same time for the same thing, writing about racial equality. But as the civil rights movement took shape, anthropology had an important place as the official scientific guardian of authoritative information on human difference. A right-wing propagandist named Carlton Putnam was putting together public arguments against school integration in the early 1960s, and his book Race and Reason was a big bestseller in the South. His main argument was that the idea of putting black children and white children together in the same schools was the result of the insidious influence of communists, anthropologists, and Jews. Gene Weltfish, as it happens, was in fact all three. Anyway, his book was censured in 1961 by the American Anthropological Association, whose incoming president was Sherry Washburn. A few months later, the motion to censure Carlton Putnam's book by the American Association of Physical Anthropologists passed overwhelmingly with one dissenting vote. That vote was cast by the president of the association, Carlton Coon of the University of Pennsylvania, who had been Ernest Houghton's second doctoral student and Sherry Washburn's TA at Harvard. Professor Coon was in fact already a public intellectual for his appearances on an early TV show called What in the World. And since he left us his correspondence, we now know that he was in fact working clandestinely with the segregationists. He was a cousin of Carlton Putnam and was developing his own theory to scientifically justify segregation. He published his book in 1962 called The Origin of Races, pretentiously titled to evoke Darwin. It made three basic claims. First, there are 5 subspecies of living humans, which can be tracked back into the Pleistocene as 5 subspecies of Homo erectus. Second, that these 5 subspecies of Homo erectus evolved into Homo sapiens at different times, whites first, and eventually pulling the other races up with them. And third, that the reason the darker-skinned races were less civilized and less educable was that they just hadn't been members of Homo sapiens for as long as Europeans. As he summarized it, it is a fair inference that the subspecies which crossed the evolutionary threshold into the category of Homo sapiens the earliest have evolved the most, and that the obvious correlation between the length of time a subspecies has been in the sapiens state and the levels of civilization attained by some of its populations may be related phenomena. No and no, but this wasn't a wacko. He was president of the association. However, this was the intellectual generation that began with the understanding that the Germans had weaponized the science improperly and maliciously. But this was an American weaponizing the science, with a set of dubious claims and interpretations, and in the present, not 20 years ago. The challenge against Professor Coon was led by Ashley Montagu and Theodosius Dobzhansky. As reported in Science, Dobzhansky closed by referring to the adverse use of Coon's theory by racist propagandists. He remarked that this demonstrates that scientists can no longer remain in ivory towers, unconcerned with the impact of their pronouncements, and that indeed it is naive and irresponsible for them to pretend they can. Coon tried to defend himself by pleading that he was apolitical, and the segregationists just happened to pick up on his value-neutral ideas. But that was a lie. Again, we have his correspondence. Suffice it to say that Professor Coon went from president of the association to pariah in just a few years. One reason is that a younger generation of physical anthropologists was approaching human variation with a new set of eyes and tools, The cultural anthropologists had been saying it all along, and the anthropological geneticist Frank Livingstone famously expressed it this way: "There are no races, there are only clines." One possibility was to avoid race altogether and replace it with population genetics. In this 1979 textbook on human variation and microevolution, race doesn't even make it into the index. By the end of the century, two other developments were shaping the field of physical anthropology as an ethical and moral science for the 21st century. In 1990, Congress passed NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which fundamentally challenged the scientific understanding of human remains as the only legitimate understanding. Human remains are not simply decayed organic matter. They are something other than that as well. They are important to other people for other reasons, which may outweigh the perceived interests of science. In other words, the progress of science is great, but when it butts up against human rights wins. The camp doctor at Auschwitz, Joseph Mengele, had a PhD in physical anthropology, which he had earned under Theodore Mollison, who had studied under our old friend Eugen Fischer. The science needed reconstruction morally. Concomitantly, the African Burial Ground project, led by Michael Blakey, reinforced the need to do physical anthropology with people, not just on them. Then in 1994, the bell curve came out and rehashed old bogus scientific arguments about the inherent intellectual capabilities of large groups of people on the basis of their scores on pencil and paper tests, once again rationalizing economic hierarchies by recourse to imaginary natural differences. And heck, we've been there many times before, over a century earlier. The argument is that inequality is the result of innate factors, not a consequence of history. That was the basic argument of hereditary aristocracies in Europe for centuries. It has never been accurate. It was the opposite view that the American Revolution was based on. As Thomas Paine explained it in Common Sense, mankind being originally equals in the order of creation, the equality could only be destroyed by some subsequent circumstance. That is to say, inequality is a fact of history, not a fact of biology. By the middle of the 1800s, this was the normative view of scholars in the nascent social sciences, as the bourgeoisie began overthrowing hereditary aristocracies all over Europe. From the left, if we want to understand imbalances of power, we study history, not science. Science is nice, but not relevant here. If you want equality, you work for it. The same point that Tom Paine was making. But now there's a backlash, the author of which is Count Arthur de Gobineau, who is pretty sure that the state of nature is inequality, and pretty sure that Native Americans, for example, are in terrible circumstances not because of genocidal policies, but because of some defect in their brains. So, the brain of the Huron Indian contains in an undeveloped form an intellect which is absolutely the same as that of the Englishman or the Frenchman? Why then, in the course of the ages, has he not invented printing or steam power? I mean, tobacco is okay, but corn and potatoes are completely overrated. Gobineau is known as the father of scientific racism, for the argument that inequality is due to nature, not history. He argued that it lay in the overall differences in the quality of their brains. In other words, the explanation for inequality lies somewhere in neurobiology. And that is the template for every subsequent exercise in populist scientific racism. The early physical anthropologists jump in with skulls and measurements to explain the economic and political and military dominance of Europeans. Madison Grant in 1916 argues that Nordic blood brings civilization, and as it gets diluted with non-Nordic blood, civilization declines. His friend, the geneticist Charles Davenport, argues that poor people have the genes for feeble-mindedness, which is what keeps them down. When he dies in 1944, he will be the sitting president of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, by the way. And 20 years after Davenport's death, Carlton Coon, another sitting president of the AAPA, argues that inequality is ultimately just the result of how long your subspecies has been Homo sapiens, rather than Homo erectus, who was just uncivilizable. And now, at the end of the 20th century, the bell curve is back to IQ testing as the source of the naturalistic difference between rich and poor. And what they all share is the reluctance to look at historical injustice as even a possible cause of economic hierarchies, and invoking science, some kind of science, to explain it by recourse to invisible underlying natures instead. But it also gave a new generation of physical anthropologists a chance to position themselves biopolitically in the 21st century. The American Association of Physical Anthropologists responded with a statement criticizing the bell curve and reaffirming its discoveries about the patterns of human variation. Ultimately, the association rebranded itself as biological anthropology rather than as physical anthropology to reflect two things. First, the expansion of the objects of study beyond physical bones to include genetics and primatology. And second, to put the callous and racist past in the rearview mirror and reconceptualize the study of the biological end of anthropology in a progressive and more scientifically accurate and appealing way. As we enter the second quarter of the 21st century, we can reflect on what we have learned in biological anthropology as we continue to research who we are and where we come from. Race is the imposition of cultural boundaries upon biological variation in the human species. It combines difference, which can readily be measured, and meaning, which cannot because it is cultural and symbolic. If you study race, you're studying something other than patterns of human variation. You're studying the cultural construction of human difference and its consequences. To the extent that there are biomedical issues associated with race, the imposition of an imaginary biology of race is far more likely to screw up an epidemiological investigation than to resolve it. Brains and heads do not explain social and cultural phenomena within our species. History does. And there is nothing in human history that suggests it to be simply an unfolding of underlying biological tendencies or natures. There is nevertheless a lot of other interesting information in human skeletons. In the same ways that human genetics differs from fruit fly genetics, the study of primates and their behavior differs from the study of other animals and their behavior. The study of monkeys is fundamentally different from the study of ants. When you work with people, you're working in a different ethical and moral universe, and especially a different political economic universe. You're also working with more fundamental cultural ideas and prejudices, and consequently you are responsible for the things you say in the name of science, because they can affect people's lives. Any science that affects people's lives adversely is bad science and should not go on. Biological anthropology exists in an empirical and moral universe and should go on. And finally, here are some suggestions for further reading.